I had just gotten kicked out of the house and came back and had verbally out loud said, I want to be a pro football player, which was so far-fetched at the time. But what I've learned is when you start to voice the things that you want and say them out loud and get clarity on those, that's when the invisible doors started to open. That certainly was the case for me.
All right, AC, we are now recording due to my error. We're now recording. There we go, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. And I typically don't do introductions, but I've been bringing on the top athletes, current and former top athletes in the world, and telling their stories. Maybe for the young guns listening to the podcast who don't know about you and what you've done in your illustrious career, I want to give a little context to who you are, what you've done. You played at Notre Dame from 90 to 93. You were a two-time All-American. You're now in the College Football Hall of Fame, drafted in the first round by the Packers, 16th overall, played in 2 Super Bowls with Brett Farve, right?
Yes, sir.
And you won one.
And we won one, and I blocked for him for 2 of his 3 MVP seasons. So I had a front row seat to elite greatness, probably a lot like you guys are starting to see with your quarterback up there in SoCal.
He's unbelievable. But so you've done a lot. Started the Joe Moore Award, which is the only group award in college football, and so you've just done a ton in your career. But we mentioned Notre Dame. I kind of want to talk a little bit. There's been a lot of talk lately. You see UCLA and USC moving now to the Big Ten, and there's talk about it. What kind of your thoughts on the state of the NCAA, Notre Dame? Could we be joining a conference, brother?
Man, I don't think we're going to have any choice, Drew. College football as we knew it, as I knew it, as you knew it, is going to change, and it's changed dramatically. The regionality, the tradition, the history, the rivalry, all of those things are going to look different. And now it's this national footprint. And what's interesting is that Notre Dame has been an independent for almost 100 plus years. And we've been one of the only schools that's had a national footprint where we have fans in all 50 states across the country, whereas most programs are very regionalized. That's kind of been the backbone of what's made college football so special. When you get the Iron Bowl with Alabama and Auburn, you get the big game between Ohio State and Michigan. You have Stanford, Cal on the West Coast, USC, UCLA. But now what we're going to see with Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC and USC and UCLA joining the Big Ten, it's a national landscape and marketplace now. The old school, we're all in this together, and the shackles of what the NCAA's definition maybe of what amateurism was is gone. The 9-0 Supreme Court decision changed all of that. That opened the door for NIL, the immediate, transfer, the immediate eligibility, the transfer portal. All of these things in and of themselves individually would be seismic changes, but it's just now happening collectively. And because of that, I think Notre Dame for the first time has to strongly consider joining a conference, because if not, scheduling becomes a problem. Having access to the new national championship potentially becomes a problem. But the biggest problem, and this is unfortunate, is revenue. Like, it's estimated that each member school of the Big Ten can earn up to $100 million per season. That's going to be their payout. Right now, the SEC and the Big Ten, I think, is at $55 million. That's basically going to double. Notre Dame has always maintained its independence, and the delta, maybe the 20 grand or 20 million a year difference that they would get by standing independent that the other schools got, they were able to navigate that. But I look at it like this: that 20 million that Notre Dame has compared to the 100 million that the Big Ten member schools are going to enjoy moving forward in the next couple years is seismic. And that's a delta that you can't overcome. And I use the analogy simply as this, Drew. Me and you are going to have a cooking contest. You get $100 to buy groceries. I only get $10 or $20 to buy groceries. Who's going to cook the better meal? It's going to be the guy that can spend $100 to buy whatever it is he wants. And that's the reason that I think Notre Dame and Jack Swarbrick have a huge decision to make. And I would be shocked if we didn't, in some form or fashion, join the Big Ten. It's not if, it's how, when, and where.
Is that 100 million you talk about, is that regardless of the school's legitimacy in terms of contention for the college football playoffs and how significant, like Rutgers will be getting the same as Ohio State? Is that kind of how the conference structure works for these schools?
Yes, it's all member institutions get an equal piece of the pie. So the reason the Big Ten brings over USC and UCLA is because they're in the number 2 media market. Those two programs, those blue bloods, those iconic schools, and certainly USC is quite a bit higher than UCLA, at least on the football side. That opens up a lot of eyeballs. It also gives the Big Ten schools an opportunity multiple times to come to the West Coast and to recruit California. The model that Notre Dame's always used, everybody's kind of, figuring this deal out. So Rutgers and Maryland, when they joined the Big Ten, that was all about the Eastern Seaboard and opening up those markets and having East Coast avenues to recruit. That's why Notre Dame joined the ACC, so they could take that Southeastern Atlantic belt through there and be able to bring those players in. Notre Dame will be able to join the Big Ten and maintain their relationship with Navy, which is a sacred cow because of what happened in World War II and basically Navy renting Notre Dame's campus and keeping the doors open. They've got built-in rivalries already with USC that can stay there, and they can still have the Shamrock series where they can go into Texas, they can go into Florida, they can play wherever it is they need to penetrate the recruiting markets and still have that luxury while creating an incredible short drive and geographic relationship with the Big Ten. I think Notre Dame was a little bit averse to join the Big Ten because they didn't want to get lumped in with everybody else. With the rapid landscape and how quickly it's changing, I just don't know if we're going to have that luxury anymore because the opportunity costs moving forward are going to be too significant to overcome.
How is Notre Dame able to keep that relationship with Navy, the Shamrock series, those things you mentioned? Are those just addendums that they would write up in their contract with the Big Ten, or does the scheduling of, I don't know if it's 12 or 13 games, do they have a 3-game buffer where they can go outside the conference and maintain those games like you're talking about?
That's going to be really interesting, and a lot of it depends on how big these conferences get, right? We're at 16 now. If they go to 20, if they go to 24, do they go to 30? Is it going to be the 64 plus Notre Dame and get to the 65 and have the 4 super conferences? All of that is yet to be determined. There's also something that's floating around about whether or not you get to a critical mass of 30 plus teams. And it's the AFC NFC model that the NFL enjoys, where CBS will take the AFC, Fox will take the NFC, and then NBC will get the Sunday night game. And it kind of gets parsed around. That is, if you're just solely doing it for money, is in the best interest of the conferences. Now, whether or not the TV networks would be willing to do that is yet to be determined, but this is all about money. And the interesting thing is, post-COVID, what we learned is how fiscally irresponsible intercollegiate athletics is. If you or I ran our households as poorly as the NCAA and these member institutions have done, we'd be out on the street. We're 2.5 years removed from Stanford cutting 16 varsity programs because there's no money. And then NIL comes up and boom, overnight, there's hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to give these 17 and 18-year-old kids to entice them to come to campus. And that's why we're seeing this accelerated shift towards this new model. And this is all right before college football playoff 2.0, mind you. And so if that's 8 teams or 12 teams is floated around, it just becomes this exponential pie. So this is the opportunity for these schools to cut the fat. It used to be where, man, we need to add strength, so we're going to bring people over. But a team like Boise, who's good enough to beat you, doesn't bring enough eyeballs, so that school can be in jeopardy. Oregon or Washington, those are 2 big brands. They're in big media markets, but is it worth $100 million? Those are the sorts of questions that the Big Ten and these other conferences are starting to ask, is whether or not it's going to be worth it. So from a Notre Dame's perspective,
if you introduce another team, that $100 million gets cut a little bit, right? Because
unless it's a Notre Dame or a USC or UCLA where that it takes it from 75 million and brings it up to 100 million. That's the math that they're doing. So not all schools, just like not all levels of football, are created equally. And this is all about a value proposition. And we know Oregon's a great program. We know that Phil Knight's there and they've got this big funding. We know that they have, the Seattle market. But the reality is it a value add to have to share this increased piece of the pie with an Oregon and Washington? No is probably the answer there, but this is going to be keeping up with the Joneses. So depending on what the SEC does with the ACC, meaning Florida, Miami, or excuse me, Florida State, Miami, and Clemson, if they add them, then the Big Ten is going to have to kind of race themselves to the top. And I think where we get is probably going to be at least 30 teams, but the ceiling being the 65.
Maybe this is a good time to transition a little bit to your story. I'm interested how the recruiting process was different. We talked a little bit about the demographics and like the regionality of these teams and how the expansion of these conferences has almost been a way for them to expand their recruiting. You were a California kid, but went to Notre Dame. Was it were you an anomaly, or was that kind of starting to happen where teams were kind of reaching all across the country to recruit?
Well, what helped that was Notre Dame. That was literally year one of the NBC contract, where we had every home game was televised. And in 1990, that was an anomaly. That just didn't happen. So I had an opportunity for my mom to see all of my home games. Plus, we were coming to California in alternating years between Stanford and USC. So we would always play in Cali. So that kind of mitigated the, man, am I ready to travel this far away? And I had the opportunity humbly to be able to go to any school I wanted to in the country, as a lot of guys like yourself have that opportunity as well. But what I think sold it for me is when I got to campus, it felt familiar. If I went to De La Salle in the Bay Area, and it's a Catholic school, and there were a lot of things where it felt familiar. And Drew, like Notre Dame ain't for everybody. So it kind of self-selects. And if you don't want to be challenged in the classroom, if you don't want to smell ethanol in the summer, if you don't want to have to wear a jacket through April, it's probably not going to be there for you. But if you want to be a part of something special and make lifelong friends and get a unique opportunity at a unique university, and you want to graduate, Notre Dame's probably going to be one of the places that you're going to consider. And that certainly was the case for me. So we signed Willie Clark that year. Also out of California, we had a ton of players coming out of Texas. Notre Dame at that time was the school that probably recruited nationally the best, whereas all others were regional. But what we're seeing now is that all the best players are leaving Southern California and they're going to the SEC. They're going to the ACC, and USC and UCLA were struggling to keep those players there. And that's why they initiated to reach out to the Big Ten, because it now helps them keep more of their talent at home and gives them a better puncher's chance going against the behemoths, because the Pac-12 hadn't made the college football playoff since 2017, and it was going to get worse much more quickly. So this move to the national landscape that Notre Dame, once again leading the charge, dues all the way back in 1990, is now going to be common practice moving forward.
How did these schools start stealing that momentum from Notre Dame on the national landscape? How did they start gaining traction, specifically the SEC, and getting all of these kids? I mean, obviously guys throw around the idea, oh, they're cheating, they're paying players. What are your ideas? Is that substantively like the reason they were just cheating? Or
it's never that simple. That's certainly one of the reasons, is the old laundering of the money, where you make an anonymous donation to the church then hires the mom of that student athlete to sweep the gym or whatever it is. The church keeps its cut, and that was the old model. Now it's all out in the open and gotten worse. But it's complicated. We had some missteps from a coaching standpoint. I think some of the critical areas that have allowed Alabama and Clemson and the Ohio States, which are the O&D lines and the defensive backfields, I think we lagged a little bit there. And that was at a time where these programs were on the rise and had some things going for them where maybe we had a little bit more headwinds. But what we're watching now with Marcus Freeman, he's crushing it on the recruiting trail. Notre Dame has the #1 class, not only in 2023, but 2024. So he's already a couple years out and crushing it. And I think people are starting to understand that times are changing at Notre Dame, and it now can be a desirable place to go. And a lot of that is because of the energy that Marcus Freeman's bringing to the recruiting trail that maybe wasn't quite there if you go back 2 or 3 coaches and what we lagged over the last decade and a half or so. But it's it's been tough for Notre Dame, but because of the national footprint that we have, we are timing this thing right, in my opinion, to be able to hit the ground running and to once again elevate ourselves to national prominence. But to do that, you have to have elite groceries, and that NBC deal, I just don't know if that's enough revenue to be able to entice the type of players we need to compete on a national level. Our record and our performance in the college football playoff is probably the best case in point of our inability to do that, but I'd expect that to change moving forward.
Well, the success of Coach Freeman early on is no surprise to me. He recruited me at Purdue back in 2013, and to this day, it was, 8 years later, I sent him a text after he got the head coaching job, not expecting a reply. I'm thinking this guy's getting swarmed with messages, congratulations. And he sent me a really lengthy text just checking in, wondering how my family and kids were doing. I'm like, it's crazy. Like, he still remembers me as I was just a recruit. I was a high school player. I hadn't done anything in college, hadn't made it to the NFL at that point, but he remembered me. And that meant a lot. And I think it speaks to his personable skills, his ability to connect with the players, and I certainly see it in him, and I think fans are going to continue to see it in him.
Yeah, we're all optimistic about what the future holds, and I like Jack Swarbrick at the poker table. He's a great poker player. He's going to do what's in the best interest of Notre Dame moving forward, and this is probably going to be his legacy and how he's remembered. He's done an incredible job overseeing our athletic department, but this is a critical time in Notre Dame's future. The landscape nationally has changed significantly. All three variables that Notre Dame needed to remain its independence, of having access to a national championship, having a home for the Olympic sports, and having a TV contract in place with NBC and maintaining that relationship, those things are still there. But what's changed outside of the scene is this exponential increase of revenue, and you just can't take a knife to a gunfight if you want to be able to succeed and compete against these teams. It was hard enough already for us to do that, and that's borne itself out. You add this additional revenue in this new landscape, and Notre Dame would be in jeopardy of getting left behind. So I think the Big Ten is a better fit for a ton of reasons for Notre Dame than the ACC would be. But they've got grant of rights tied up through 2036. So there's a lot to unwind there. And I think that's why Notre Dame will be patient and prudent and not kind of work something out quickly, because if the ACC dissolves, that's easy for them to make the move then. But if it doesn't, they're going to have a hell of a time getting out of it, even if they want to. Still possible, but becomes costly. So there's some chess and cat and mouse that's being played as I think Swarbrick tries to understand what the landscape is, what the options are. Kevin Warren's got ties to Notre Dame. Like, there's so much that makes sense for that to happen. But you got to figure out the mechanics of how that can happen, when that can happen. And I think once they figure that out, it's going to happen.
So unpacking your football journey a little bit more, going to De La Salle, then to Notre Dame, was football always in the cards for you growing up? Was sports something that your parents had you in at an early age? Did you grow up around it?
Yeah, I played a lot of sports as a kid. The Chicago Bears in 1985 Super Bowl they won with the video that they did after. My nickname growing up was Frizz. My name is Frizz. I'm no dumb cookie. Blah 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 blah. So playing backyard football and all that stuff. But I was too big for my age group to play Pop Warner, and I was too young for my weight class. So I was kind of a tweener. So I didn't play organized football, tackle football, to my freshman year in high school. Broke my ankle on like day 2, so that year was gone. Played my sophomore year in another school, not De La Salle, where I basically smoked weed and drank every day, so that didn't work out. So my mom kicks me out of the house, and that was kind of my wake-up call. And then boom, that night there was this show on TV about the school De La Salle across the bay, and their head coach was talking about, my players aren't it. They know that they're part of it, and they were talking about accountability and trust. And I was like, man, Mom, that's the type of place I need to go. So mind you, I had just gotten kicked out of the house and came back and had verbally out loud said, I want to be a pro football player, which was so far-fetched at the time. But what I've learned is when you start to voice the things that you want and say them out loud and get clarity on those, that's when the invisible doors started to open. That certainly was the case for me. And I went from being a DNF student, being kicked out at 14, to graduating with a 3.6 GPA, getting a full ride to Notre Dame, graduating in 3.5 years, eventually ended up being in the College Football Hall of Fame, which is a hell of a far distance from, being on my buddy's floor using his underwear and socks as a pillow for that week when I got kicked out of the house. So sports was always important to me, but it wasn't something that I always worked at and thought was a viable vehicle until I was probably 15 or 16 years old.
What did that do to your relationship with your mom at the time when she kicked you out?
Made it stronger. She was always worried about me and what I was going to be doing. And I was an only child. My dad wasn't in the picture when I was 2. And there was a lot of stuff that I went through as a kid, and physical and sexual abuse and abandonment. And we moved every 2 years. So I was the new kid in school with new friends, new teachers, new everything. I was biracial. So I never felt black enough, never felt white enough, felt too black, felt too white. Like I just didn't know where I was in the world. And I just wanted to be accepted and liked and feel like I mattered. So that's why I kind of went down the road of, smoking and drinking and doing all the things that knucklehead kids like to do. But there was a moment, Drew, you'll appreciate this. So those invisible doors started open. My mom was a pediatric ICU nurse at Children's Hospital in Oakland. Like 2 days after that, somebody comes in and says, hey, after I see this show about De La Salle, like, hey, we got this house in Concord that we're looking for tenants. Anybody looking for a house in Concord? My mom was like, I am. A couple of weeks after that, another colleague comes in and says, hey, the city of San Francisco has this program where nurses rehabilitate, crack babies off of the drugs while the parents hopefully get clean and sober, and you reunite them. It's called Baby Moms. It's paying double what we're making here. Is anybody interested? My mom raised her hand again. So very quickly, within like 3 or 4 months of all this happening, boom, we were living in Concord. I was down the street from De La Salle. I passed the entrance exam. There was financial aid that took place. So I worked a lot of the fairs and had to earn my keep, so to speak. But we got to that first football practice. And I'm telling you, man, it was one of the hardest days of my life. I got mother scratched and dog cussed like you have never seen and heard. Like if the play was going right, I went left. If it was going left, I went right. I couldn't do anything right. That's not the way that we do things here. You're lazy bringing these bad habits here. And it was like moving so fast. Now, remember, I had never really played football, so I didn't know if I was any good. I thought I liked it because I liked playing in my buddy's backyard. But
you were the fridge.
What was coming at me now?
You were big enough.
I was big, but I was like, man, I was the fridge. And I was like, man, these dudes are yelling at me. So I go home after that first practice, go into my room, I shut the door and I'm crying, man. My mom comes in, says, what happened? I was like, Mom, I can't do it. I'm so sorry. Like, they were yelling at me and like, I didn't know what I was doing. And like, I'm sorry that we moved here and you changed jobs, but it's over. I can't go back. I can't do it. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, you need to figure out if what you want is worth the price that you might have to pay to get it. And if it is, I'll see you in the morning and I'll have your breakfast ready for you. And if not, that's okay too. I'll never say a word, but you got a decision to make, and boom, shut the door. Bruh, let me tell you what, I sat on the edge of the bed. I don't know if I got a wink or a lick of sleep that night, just thinking about, man, what am I going to do? Am I going to get up? How can I do it? I couldn't go. And somehow, some way, I got up and I went to practice that next day. And I got my ass chewed again, but I made a block. I went back the next day, got my ass chewed again, but I made a couple more blocks. Then I kept making a couple more blocks and a couple more. As it turns out, I was pretty damn good in football. I just didn't know it yet. And I think that's what a lot of us now, especially with the way the world's looking, we stop before the miracles occur. And if we want to achieve the things that we want, if we want to mine the gold from our lives, we have to be willing to step into that place of uncomfortability, that place of I don't know, where we don't know how it's going to work out, and use that courage to take that leap of faith. And I think about, had I stayed in bed that morning, how different my life would have been if I take Notre Dame out of it, if I take the NFL out of it, if I take blocking for Brett Favre out of it, if I take working for CBS out of it, if I take the time that you and I met doing at the football banquet of Wake Up the Echoes, doing this podcast, I start to think about all of the things that followed that one decision that I had no idea would change the course of my life, but I did have the courage to take that leap, and everything that has followed has just opened up and been worth it. So I like to tell that story because I think a lot of us are sitting on the edge of our proverbial beds, not knowing what it is we're going to do or how we're going to make it or whether or not we should make a change. But the gold in our lives lies just beyond where we're afraid or unwilling to go. And the way that we mine that gold is with courage. And that moment changed the course of my life forever. So I like to share it because it had a significant impact. And the reason it had the impact it did, to circle all the way back to the question you asked about my relationship with my mom, was because she had the foresight to challenge me and put the ball back in my court. And I accepted the challenge, and things have worked out. Turned out I was pretty good at football.
It's interesting in people's stories, there's kind of two pivotal moments of decision making. There's one at the start where it's like, kind of seems where you were at a little bit. You went to day one of practice. You're like, man, I don't know if this goal of the NFL is even worth it. There's that point at the beginning. And then there's that point somewhere down the line. It varies for different people where they're like, I've really been putting a lot of effort and time, and I'm really not seeing the results I want to see. And there's this beautiful, beautiful image I love of this. It's an exponential growth, and it's the idea of momentum. And it's this idea of you're going to start small and things are going to remain small for a really long time, but there's going to be a point where these invisible miracles that you talk about take place, and then this expansive, this exponential growth take place. You see it in businesses all the time. You see it with Tesla. Years they're operating in the red. They're not really growing. And then a moment happens and they gain that momentum. Was there ever like a point in your life, like you made that decision at the beginning, but along the road where you're like, man, I'm really not seeing the results I want to see here, and you thought about potentially giving up or quitting?
Well, it's interesting. That didn't happen with sports because the harder I worked, the better I got. Like everybody worked hard, but they got this much better. I got like this much better. And that was because of the God-given talent, not because I had anything unique that I did. We all worked hard. I think where that showed up, and that carried through with Notre Dame, and I had Joe Moore, the best offensive line coach in the history of our sport. Harry Heastand, probably a very close second, and a disciple of Joe Moore's. So that's not that's quite a bit more than just coincidental. I think my moment, Drew, came after I'd won the Super Bowls, after I'd signed a free agent deal out in San Diego and played with the Chargers and retired at 28 years old because it was the law of diminishing returns from my body. Where I was at in my life, I had a big fancy house, a fancy car, coffee cans full of money buried in the backyard, if you will. And I was the living, breathing American dream. Like most of my neighbors would have traded places with me because I was going to hunt and fish and surf and golf for the rest of my life, from 28 years on. And 2 short years after that, it was the darkest place in my life. And that was a situation where I had to get out of my own way again. I wasn't seeing the results of what I was doing. And that's when I made the decision to get sober and give up drinking and smoking, which was kind of the way that I handled, it was my negative coping strategy, if you will. So that was where I saw it after sports, when the more I tried to fit in, the more I tried to party, the more I tried to be the big shot and buy tables and models and bottles, the more of that I did, the less value I was receiving in terms of peace and serenity and some of the core things, the significance, the purpose, the community, all these things that I got through football weren't taking place in the real world. But the problem was me, and I had to get myself out of my way to finally be able to take a hold of those things. And, no, not uncoincidentally, like the second I did that, things, magically started getting better. So that journey, man, that hero's journey of going from the known to the unknown, the familiar to the unfamiliar, it's what happens when we get to that place of I don't know, that we enjoy our successes, that determines the quality of our lives, that allows us to do the things that we want to do based on our own definitions. And that's not something that happens once or twice. That happens all the time when a parent dies, or a divorce, when your kids get sick, or you get cut, or you get injured. Like it's over and over and over. And that's why resilience is so important. And I think that's one of the things that sports really teaches us. You don't have any choice. You got to get your ass up off the ground, back into the huddle, get the play, and walk up to the line of scrimmage and get ready for that ball to be snapped. And I just don't think that a lot of other sports offer that. And that's one of the things I'm most grateful for is the sport of football, is that it taught me that I was capable of being able to do more than I often think. And that has extended well beyond my ability to block a 3 technique.
I've heard twice now you're kind of like struggle with, if you will, with like abuse, specifically the substance abuse. You mentioned it with 14 and 15, and then the couple years after you were playing. I'm interested for maybe listeners who are dealing with that in their own life, kind of how you process that. Like as a 14 or 15-year-old, did you process it, or did you kind of just stuff it under the rug and kind of do the football thing, and then it resurfaced when football was no longer in the picture? What was dealing with that like for you?
Yeah, I think at 14, 15, man, I was clueless about what I was doing and why. And that's the problem, right? Our brains don't stop developing until we're about 25. So I think literally like legally incapable of learning or making good decisions, at least for me anyway. So I knew that behavior wasn't good and wasn't helping me. And because De La Salle mandated that we sign contracts so we wouldn't, drink or smoke, it became easy because it was positive peer pressure and wasn't an issue. But then I got a chance to go to college where, all bets were off, and all of a sudden some of those frameworks and parameters weren't there. I'm in the O-line room, older guys are 21 and can go get alcohol, and I was back off and running. What I know now that I didn't know then is that alcoholism is a disease. It's a metabolic inability to be able to process alcohol efficiently. And because of that, when it goes from alcohol to acetaldehyde to acetone, that lingering effect of not being able to do it in and of itself creates this craving effect. So my brain gets a signal when I've had my first beer, ooh, that was great, have another one. And I take another one. Now I've got this level that's building up. Then I have another one. And because I can't metabolize things really quickly, there's not enough beers. The saying we say is one is too many and 1,000's never enough. So it was that accelerated blackout drinking where I was like, man, this probably isn't good. And I got journals back at Notre Dame where it's like, man, I got to keep an eye on my drinking. It's 3 or 4 nights a week, but I'm playing well. My grades are well. And I'm like, what's my first clue that I got a problem is I'm keeping a damn journal in college, right? I'm 19 years old and tracking my use of alcohol, but I weighed that against my performance. So as long as my performance didn't drop, I was good. And I foolishly use that same logic in the NFL. And that was a big reason why my body broke down. The science is pretty clear about what takes place and how it can't regenerate and repair itself, and how you're twice as likely to be injured if you drink to excess within 72 hours of physical exertion. Like, it's crystal clear, but I didn't know that. I didn't think about it. I didn't care about it. So coming from a family of alcoholics where my grandfather was an everyday drinker, my dad has struggled with abuse at times throughout the years. Myself, I'm watching one of my kids eat so fast, he's almost out of breath. Like, that's in the Taylor family lineage. But the good news is there was an app for that. And the alcoholism that I suffered from was the treatment to what really ailed me. And that was the spiritual malady. I wasn't connected with my higher power. I thought that I was the big shot and I had all the answers. So for me, I had I knew I wasn't the answer, right? 110% of doing my best effort was that I was a drunk 2 years after, leaving the NFL, drinking 5-6 nights a week and just sad and depressed and lonely. So I chose to put my faith in other people that had been there and done that. And through that, I had good teammates that walked me along. I worked a 12-step program, which is basically a really poorly disguised way to meet your maker and your concept of what a higher power is. And that was when I liberated myself. I needed to be liberated and freed from myself. And that process allowed me to do it. So I haven't had drugs or alcohol in my body in 20 plus years. I don't miss it. I'm one of the lucky ones where it just got removed. But my wife's never seen me drink. My kids have never seen me drink. Most of my colleagues have never seen me drink. And as a result, man, it's the thing that has significantly impacted my life. And I couldn't imagine. I wouldn't give up 100 of those lifetimes before for half of this life that I've had these last 20 years.
That's awesome, AT. I'm so happy for you, brother.
I appreciate it, man. We're all out here winging it, Drew. Like, we think we're equipped. We got the world's coming at us fast. We got wives, we got kids, we got viruses we can't see. We got crazy people wearing masks. We got crazy people not wearing masks. We got politics. Like, the world is just throwing stuff at us. And I think it's so important that we treat our mental health like we do our physical health. And we know that it takes focus and attention and time and effort to be able to deal with our physical injuries, right? You hurt your shoulder, you hurt your knee, you get into the training room 3, 4, 5 times a day because your why is so important. But it's interesting what happens when it becomes invisible injuries, right? As it relates to our mental health, all of a sudden, we freeze. We can't see it. We can't take an MRI or an X-ray to show how it is we're feeling because we don't understand it. I think a lot of times, we get weirded out and just shut down. So what we're seeing, this exponential increase of completed suicides, deaths of despair, like we saw with Jalen Ferguson in Baltimore when he put some things into his body. Like, that's what I did with alcohol. It was, I wanted relief from myself, and I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. And this is a 25-year-old kid that's playing in the NFL and has a woman and kids in his life. But life's terms are such that he wanted relief from that. And it ended up, unfortunately, costing him his life. Well, there's so many of us that are out there that struggle that way, but there are ways that are way better and way more efficient to be able to get the same relief, where dealing with life on life's terms isn't quite as complicated. Recovery was one of the ways that I've chosen to do that. There are many others, but I think it's kind of topical with where we're going out in the state of the world right now, because people are freaking hurting and they don't know what to do about it. And that's part of what I'm looking forward to do in the off season. When I'm not working for CBS, I do mental health stuff and I talk about recovery, and I created a website called mentalhealthbestpractices.com. There's nothing to sign up for. There's nothing to charge. It's just an agnostic aggregation of tools and tips and techniques that can help people improve their mental health so that they can begin or continue their journey to enjoying this incredible opportunity we have on this blue planet out in the middle of freaking nowhere.
You made an interesting comment of like meeting your maker in the recovery, and it seems like it was this journey of faith, but you also mentioned going to like a Catholic high school. So I'm interested how those kind of intertwine and what that recovery and what you kind of meant by that.
Yeah. So in the recovery world specifically, it's the verbiage is higher power of your understanding. So what happens is, guys, if they come in and they hear God, they're out the door. So
why do you think that is?
Because they could have had bad experience in the church with a pastor or somebody, especially in the Catholic Church with what we've seen that's come out. Maybe they had a bad relationship with their parents and their parents hid behind their own faith, even though it wasn't a godly faith. Maybe it was a shadow or a darker side of that faith. So they start to reject the things that maybe they felt rejected them. But it's a program really of attraction, not promotion. So I think what happens to a lot of guys is they walk into the rooms, a lot of people, and end up catching God. Like, it's undeniable when you stop and the fog starts to clear about what's taken place. Like, is all of this coincidence? Like, there's just like miracle number 76 in my own life. I look back and it's like, man, there's a lot more going on than I think I'm fully aware of. That's one thing, that's belief, but the faith is actually relying on that, right? Like, fear is this maybe unjustified belief that things aren't going to work out. And faith is maybe the opposite, where you have this unjustified belief that things are going to work out. And that's a big leap to go from belief to faith. But I really feel like that's what we're all on this planet to do, is to figure out and navigate that journey. So it looks different for everybody. But at the end of the day, when we're in situations and our bottom's pretty low, we want a hand up just to get out of where we're at. And there's always a hand from God that's able to be there. So I think De La Salle, really, to answer your question, started that process for me. My mom was a church rejecter because of her family of origin and the things that happened in her lifetime. So she exposed us to everything. But when I got to De La Salle, when that continued at Notre Dame, I started to figure out what my own understanding of that is, and of Christ and of God and of spirituality, and whether it's Buddha or Allah. I took world religions. I took, medical ethics classes. I started to explore this stuff to figure out what felt right for me. And I think, however it ends up looking, we're all on that journey to a certain degree, but my faith is the critical pillar of my foundation of everything that's ever happened in my life. And that doesn't always mean that I keep God front and center. And I'll move him to the side, put my wife. I'll move him to the side, put my work. I'll move him to the side, put me. and then I get kicked in the teeth and go, okay, maybe put you back on the driver's seat when I got the bloody lips. And again, that's the belief, faith struggle that I think all of us have, but having something greater than yourself to believe in is a critical piece of what sports is based on, right? You have teammates, you're part of something greater than yourself. My faith allows that is also true on a much more significant level. And I mean, if that's not right, nothing in my life is right.
I love what you said about faith being an idea that things are going to be all right, whereas fear is this idea that things might not work out the way that I hope that they will. And for me, I know faith was a bedrock for me getting through those knee injuries at Notre Dame, because all the science and everything would tell me that you'll never be the same player. And kind of your chances of getting to college football weren't great in the first place. I was a baseball player, and I really lucked out and got in front of some people and got seen and met an organization called Athletes with Purpose that really got me in front of college coaches. I came from not a small town, but a school that really had no football history, and college coaches weren't coming to my school. We weren't De La Salle. We were Carroll High School in the cornfields in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so to get that exposure, so my chances were low there. I get there, and then I have these knee injuries. So I'm like, man, my chances of getting to the NFL are really slim. But I had this underlying underwaving faith that I was going to be a better player after my knee injuries. And I can't explain to people why I felt that way, but I had this really deep-rooted peace about it. And I just kept getting better, and I can't describe it. I don't know why. I mean, sure, I did things to take care of my body. I didn't drink. I didn't do these things. So I took care of my nutrition. I drank my water like we were talking about when I wasn't recording on here. There's his jug. I always had my jug. But I was doing those things, but I had the faith was really the bedrock that helped propel me. And now I'm playing in the NFL and living out my dream. But it's cool what happens to a person when they get a little ounce of like belief and hope. There was this like cool even experiment talking about this the other day. I was talking about with a buddy is they did an experiment with these mice, and these mice, they stuck them in water, and basically they just had to tread in water, and they saw how long they could do it. In the first trial, before they essentially just like fainted and they had to pull them out, I think they lasted 12 minutes. Well, they pulled them out. They gave them some warm like housing. They gave them food and water and whatever, and they redid the trial 12 hours later. Well, when they redid the trial 12 hours later, the mice treaded water for I don't know the number of hours, but it was hours. And it's like, how do you go from 12 minutes to X hours? It's like, how do you do like you just ran your body like to the limit, and then you get a little food and water. And they said their hypothesis was the hope. The mice had the hope that somebody was about to come grab them from the bucket of water and take them out. And that's what kept them going. And so I just hear it constantly all the time. I hear it in your story. I see it in mine. It's like just a little bit of hope. And I think our world's a little hope starved.
Yeah. Amen to that, my brother. Good Lord. And that's why I think it's important for, I think it was Gandhi that had the quote, be the change you want to see in the world. Like that needs to start in my living room, right? To have hope with my own kids. It works when I go to the grocery store and I'm talking to the checkout lady or guy. Like I can share some hope there. In the recovery world, it's hope, strength, and courage, right? We share what it was like, what we did about it, what it's like now. That gives people tools, but it also creates the possibility like, damn, if Drew or AT could do it, maybe I could do it. Like, and that's why it's so important to be fully who we are. That was literally impossible for me to do, man. I wouldn't have had the foresight that you are to do this podcast back then because I was so self-centered. It was all about me, but it was only about part of me. And what I'm realizing now is I need to bring the big me with the little me. When I'm just in my ego and self-centered and focused on me, that's little me. But when I'm my big me, it's all connected. And this holistic integration of the part of me that played football, the part of me that's on CBS as a college football analyst, the part of me that's in recovery, the part of me that is aware of what's taking place in mental health and wants to be part of whatever that solution is going to be. That's the integrity. That's the integral rejoining, the remembering of who I fully am. And it doesn't have to be an either or. And that's why I live most of my life. And I'm talking about, like, this is recent, Drew, where for the first time on my Twitter feed, I'm putting on my touchy-feely recovery mental health stuff with my college football hard-hitting analysis that doesn't exist. And I was scared to do that because, like, my boys in ball, like, that don't know me like this, what might they think? Well, now I don't give a shit what they think. The world needs all of us to be our most authentic selves. And I cheat the world and I cheat myself when I don't bring all of me to the table. Sometimes it's too much of me that comes to the table, which my wife will be quick to point out. But that's the ego part. That's the part that I got to take away. It's not that I'm not enough. It's that my whole life I've been too much of what I'm not. And now as I round second base and I'm on the back nine, I'm 49, I'm probably halfway there. Like, I'm going to make this time that I have count, and I don't have the time to not be who I was uniquely created to be. And there's room for both. You can be a kick-ass football player and do a podcast that talks about things that matter simultaneously. Both of those things can be true. And I don't think when I was younger, I fully understood or appreciated that. So I want to honor and acknowledge what it is you're doing. And you're not the only one. There's a lot of people out there that are doing it. And my personal belief is it took a long time for us to get where we're at. And if we hike 20 years in, we might have to hike 20 years out. But it looks exactly like what you and I are doing, which is being who we are and bringing our full selves into everything that we do.
Did you struggle to be yourself when you came in as a first-round draft pick to the Packers, where you kind of like, or you kind of mentioned like, hey, if my football guys saw this side of me, like, what would they think? Did you feel like you were your full self coming in? What was that? I mean, you were walking into a locker room full of legendary guys. I mean, we're talking about Brett Favre and all these guys you played with. Did you feel comfortable as a young guy to be yourself, or did you feel like you were putting on to be this guy maybe that you weren't?
I was scared to death, bro. Scared to death as a first-round draft pick, 16th player taken overall. Scared to death that somebody, anybody, everybody was going to see that I wasn't any good, because that's the talk track that was in my brain. And I hid behind always staying driven and never being satisfied. But it really was automatic negative thoughts where I felt insecure. Making matters worse was I ruptured my patella tendon on day 4, June 6, 1994. I didn't even have a contract yet. We were in minicamp, OTAs, doing one-on-one pass rushes without pads, which can get physical, but certainly not enough to blow out my patella tendon. So I was on IR right out of the gate. So everything I was doing from that point forward was, yes, to get back on the field, but I just wanted to feel a part of. I wanted to feel like I fit in. They moved the drill 10 yards. My life stopped in that moment. Their practice didn't skip a beat. And I got a very hard lesson that I didn't matter. They brought Guy McIntyre in to replace me the very next day. He's a dude I watched play as a kid with the 49ers. And it was this surreal moment of like, damn, like, where's my place in the world and on this team? So as a result of that, I started to wear masks and try to fit in and hang out with the cool kids and party. And those guys all became my friends. But I was incapable at 21 years old of even knowing who I was authentically, let alone being able to show up fully in that respect. And I think that's true for a lot of young people. Now, as we have NIL that's coming into college and all the expectations and the baby mama drama and the family members that are coming out of the woodworks and wanting to have, a hookup and like all of those things, these kids are going to have to be dealing with this stuff at a much earlier age. And I was at 21 incapable of doing it. If I'm being honest, like at 49, that shit's still a struggle some days. But that's the challenge. And again, I think that's what the first 49 years of my life have taught me, was that it's worth it to be me, that there's value showing up fully as I fully and authentically am. And sometimes that's not appropriate to show the world, but sometimes it is. So I'm more discerning about how and when and where I do that. But ultimately, wherever I go, there I am. And the world and myself are much better off when I show up as my full authentic self, the both and, the dude that is in the College Football Hall of Fame, but also knows what it feels like to be at the bottom and wondering if his life is ever going to get better, if he'll ever feel joy again, if he's worth loving, if his life's ever going to get back to where it was. Like, those things were real for me when I retired and started to transition. And then, the death of parents and all the things that come up. What my previous life has taught me, if you will, is like, I'm a resilient cat. I'm going to get back in the huddle and I'm going to get to play and I'm going to be scared and I might be crying, but I'm going to put my hand in the dirt and that ball's going to get snapped and I'm going to give it everything I have. And that's what I'm grateful for football, is that I learned to be resilient physically and then secondarily mentally. And those things still serve me to this day. So that's part of that integration of the both me's is my sporting background, but also being a good teammate in this context with which we're talking. And it's all the same stuff. It just took me a while to figure that out.
Were there things you did in that rookie season after rupturing your patella to kind of manage the expectations that you had and others had being a first-round draft pick? Were there things resources, things you did, teammates like you sought advice from in dealing with these mental battles, if you will, that you were having in your head?
Yeah, it was. I was more of a wild turkey and Coors Light guy. That was where I got a lot of my support, I think. But yeah, your teammates are always there for you. Pat McKenzie's the orthopedic surgeon, was there. I still believe he's in Green Bay, probably close to retiring, but he was a big Notre Dame fan. I remember meeting him at the combine. So I'd go to his house and just hang out and be a guy. There were definitely people in my family that I leaned on. My surrogate family from South Bend, Katie and Mike Schaefer were always there for me. But it was tough, man. Like, I didn't know what I was going to be capable of doing. I knew that I was pretty good coming out, but boom, I had the patella tendon rupture on day 4, was on IR my rookie year, came back, played that entire next season, boom, did the same injury on my other knee in the first round of the playoffs against Atlanta there in Lambeau. And at that point, I'm like, man, like, what did I do? Like, I know I was, done some jacked up things, but like, really, like 2 knees back to back? And there had never been another NFL player that had ever recovered from 2 ruptured patella tendons and come back to play. I was the first. There's since have been many, but those expectations, I basically didn't have any, Drew, but I also felt like I didn't have any choice. What else was I going to do? It was get in there and grind and rehab and do the best I could. But even while I worked hard in the training room and the weight room at night, I'd be drinking. So I was negating all of that strength and all of the advancements and all that work I put in. I was minimizing it intentionally because the emotions of having to deal with that were my primary driver. And that would be the thing I would go back and do if I could change anything in my career. And there are no mistakes, so I probably wouldn't accept this. But if I was forced to have a do-over, I would have treated my body with the way I've seen you do it and other players do it, where you realize you're a Formula One race car. If you put shitty fuel in a Formula One race car, it'll still run, but it ain't going to run nearly as well if it's clean fuel. Treating food and what I put into my body as fuel versus, things to help me feel better or, give me some confidence to go talk to girls would probably be at the top of the list of changes I would make.
I think this conversation with like alcohol, specifically within the realm of athletics, is so interesting because as somebody who has chosen like not to drink, I have no idea what like my body would feel like otherwise. Do you have any idea, or like if you sit back and think about it, like had you not like drank, how many more years that might have added to your career? Do you think it's something like where, man, I could have 2x'd my playing career? Like, do you think it's that significant of something that it's worth eliminating it out of your diet while you're playing?
No doubt. 100%. Really? I don't know if it would have 2x'd it, but I came out Bryant Young, Notre Dame alum, 1994.
Bryant's awesome. I met Bryant this past year. He's awesome.
They don't make better people than BY. They also don't make harder workers. And he and I took our very first rep at Notre Dame together when we was just, freshmen, rookies coming in, and battled each other, many years in the NFL and all the way through. I always envisioned having a career that was on par with what he did and what Jerome Bettis did. Those were all guys in my class, and coming out of college and going into college, like, we were comparably good. I was a first-round draft pick, but I was an undrafted free agent, no grade guy as it relates to taking care of my body, where that wasn't true for Bryant. And I don't know if it was for Jerome or not, but it certainly negated what it is I did. And I'll share this story with you. The year I got my second patella tendon, our star wide receiver, Robert Brooks, had an ACL. So he got hurt after me, but came back and played before me. And I was in there every day on the Cybex, every day doing stem and mobs and getting myself back to be ready. But at night, I would go out and party. And what he would do was he would drink green juice. The Juice Man Plus guy was a former Green Bay Packer. He was in his 90s. I forget the guy's name, but he kind of took Robert up underneath his wing. And I watched in real time the difference between what Robert did and the day cycle and what I did. We worked as hard. Remember what I talked about in high school where I worked this hard and I got this much better? It was the opposite. I worked hard, got this much better. Robert got this much better. And the reason he did is because he took care of his body. You cannot underestimate the role of what it is we put in our bodies. We think it doesn't affect us, but it affects us profoundly. So the decisions that you've made and that a lot of other people make with respect to that, I think we're starting to understand how important sleep is and recovery is. And I'll share this with you. So I'm an old head. Had brain scans
on the sleep front. I read a tweet the other day. It's like, sleep is the most underrated legal steroid in the world of sports.
Bro. So, and so's water, right? I was at the tail end where water made you a wussy. You need water, now run again. Turns out water's a pretty good performance enhancer. Turns out that we spend 1/3 of our life on this planet in sleep state. It's where everything happens, where our bodies recalibrate and regenerate and all the growth happens. It's when we get taller. It's like 1/3. If you live to be 133 years of your life would be in this state. And it's the thing that many of us neglect the most. And I'll share this with you. I had a brain scan that measured blood flow in our brains. It's called a SPECT scan. They did a 100 NFL player study, active and retired. When you look at the brain scans and what happens to us, with traumatic brain injury and the things that a lot of our brains enjoy, there's damage, obviously, that takes place. When I got my test and my scan, he said I'm doing better than average. Excuse me. And the reason why is because I don't drink alcohol and I treat my sleep apnea. So for the retired players who may be listening, the two things that can impact negatively your brain health and function and emotion and processing and memory is to drink alcohol and to not sleep well. So that's on the back end. So for the younger active players, you can't do enough. You can't sleep well enough. You can't put enough good food in your body to negate the opposite of that, I guess it will. Maybe that didn't make sense. What I'm trying to say is make sure you get your sleep, make sure you put good things into your body because it affects you not only now, but down the line. And again, at 22 years old, where I was struggling to fit in, I didn't have any confidence with the ladies and I wanted to go out and get this circumferential validation when I really wanted vulnerability and intimacy, but didn't know how to get it. So I took some booty instead. Like all that stuff was in my, algorithm, if you will. And it looked like me being out in the club and drinking and doing all these things. So the drivers and being aware of what it is we're doing and why is really important for us to be successful and accomplish the things that we want. And sleep and drugs and alcohol and those sort of things should be heavily weighed and considered because they're having profound impacts on our ability to perform in all the areas of our lives.
I want to end with this. I know we're running up on our time block, but I want to talk a little bit about the Joe Moore Award, which you named after legendary coach Joe Moore, who coached you at Notre Dame. What was your idea behind starting that? And I know it's the only group award in college football, but what kind of prompted you to say, hey, let's recognize the top group? There's the Outland Trophy and all these other awards that recognize the individuals, but you're like, hey, let's go recognize the group. Was it difficult to get that like successful? I feel like people want to see like the individual awards. Was it tough getting traction and getting recognition for that award early on?
Not really, from a team and player and O-line coach interest, and from a fan interest. I mean, it was immediately hugely successful. Now we're still waiting for the market and sponsorship to come to kind of validate us on that front, but we're still a young award and we're working on the value that we can bring. But I'm a public speaker, and I was talking a lot and telling Joe more stories, and I'd always get choked up in this one story where he taught me that I always had 5 more in me. And they had this football camp in Pittsburgh that I was never going to. So I called his son, James, was like, James, I'm coming next year, no matter what. And we just started talking, and we started belly laughing. And it was about the room and the guys. And it didn't matter whether you were a walk-on or an All-American. If you were in Joe's room, the expectation was the same. You had to give everything you had, no matter what. That's a very Harry Heastandy thing that's been adopted as well. But it was about the room and the guys. So we looked at an offensive line coach of the year award. It was like, man, I won the Lombardi. There's the Outland. There's all these different things you can do. The Remington Award for centers. So I went to ESPN's website and I looked at the college football awards, and every single one was an individual award. I was like, boom, that's it. I said, we're going to be a group award. How do we do that? I have no idea, but we're going to do it. And that decision got made June 7th of 2015. And on December 17th, I think, of that year, mid-December for sure, we were in Alabama's locker room with, the 7-foot tall, 6-foot long, 3-foot wide trophy, and talking about what it was to be resilient and to be tough and to work together as a team. So he was really good at getting us to kick the crap out of people, but he also did this incredible job of teaching us to be the best versions of ourselves. And that's really what the award's about. The Joe Moore Award is about toughness, and it's about teamwork. And those things not only are the foundational pillars of the sport of football, they're the foundational pillars of all good societal endeavors. So we celebrate that. We use the O-line to recognize those characteristics, but underneath that, it's all about working as hard as you can for the dude next to you to make great things happen for other people.
AT, I appreciate you so much. I feel like I knew of you before this, but I really feel like I know you now. And I appreciate you being vulnerable in different areas of your life and sharing your story. And I know it's going to impact a lot of our listeners. And so I can't thank you enough for taking an hour out of your time. I know you got your workout group in the morning. I know you got a busy schedule, and I pray blessings over your career in broadcasting, over the award, and over the mental health stuff you're doing online, man. You keep rocking it, man.
I appreciate you, Drew. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, man. I always enjoy talking about things that matter with good folks, and that certainly includes you. So I'm in SoCal too, man. I know you right up the road, so we may have to have this be the start of something versus just a one-off. But I enjoy watching you play. I enjoyed watching you play at Notre Dame, and certainly now with the Chargers. And if I can ever be assistance to you or help in any capacity, online or off, in any respects, let me know, brother. Go Irish.
Go Irish, man.